and welcome to the lineup. Today is April the 20th, 2023. I'm Barry Stagner. Very glad to have you joining us again this week. And we've got a lot of stories to cover once again tonight. Lots of things happening out in the world as they relate to Bible prophecy or things that at least point to their fulfillment in the not too distant future. And before we jump in, I wanted to comment. This has actually been on my mind for a while. Because I see a lot of misinformation given out there in relation to Bible prophecy, some of the things going on in our world today that some are pointing to as the fulfillment of this, and they relate to China. And, somebody commented last week on YouTube or somewhere. But anyway, they asked if I had had a slip of the tongue when I said that China is not mentioned in Bible prophecy. And so let me just clean that up a little bit. And, some people make the argument, and they'd be right. There are no nations, really, modern nations mentioned in the Bible as it relates to Bible prophecy outside of Israel and Persia or Iran. And, understanding this, I think one thing we have to keep in mind is that when nations are mentioned in the Bible or their geographic areas are identified, and that's what most of the Ezekiel war scenario is. The table of nations back in Genesis 10 is the names there are used to basically identify geographic regions of the world. Now, I will say most of the nations named there under the descendants of Noah are related to modern day Turkey. And Rosh is in relation to Russia. Some would debate that subject. And of course, Persia is mentioned, and that is Iran. Clearly, Libya, is also mentioned directly. The modern nation it would be that nation. Ethiopia is mentioned there. And that would not be the modern nation of Ethiopia, but Ethiopia in antiquity was the area directly south of the nation of Egypt, which would equate to modern day Sudan. Now, the reason I wanted to address this is because I've seen multiple people make mention of the fact that, China is definitely a player in the last day scenario and even named among the judgments of God, which I would disagree with, and I'll tell you why. Revelation 16:12 says, when the sixth angel poured out his bowl, these are the bowl judgments. This is the final and undiluted wrath of God. It's finally completed. And after the bowl judgments in Revelation 16, it speaks in 17 and 18 of the final destruction and elimination of Babylon, which I believe to be both ecclesiastical, the false religion of the world at that time, as well as political Babylon, the world system dominated by the Antichrist. I personally do not believe it relates to the literal ancient city of Babylon. If that were true, then the rapture is a long way off, and so is the tribulation, because modern day Iraq is hardly the global center of commerce. And so I think it talks about the whole world system. But again, recognizing that the Bible talks about these particular nations by the ancient settlers of those areas gives us a geographic identification. Now, when this final wrath of God is poured out in the bowl judgments recorded in Revelation chapter 16, and they happen in very quick succession, we're told that the sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water dried up, so that the way for the king, or the way of the kings of the east, might be prepared. Now, the first thing we make a mistake in interpreting this, I think many do, I should say, is that we look at it through the lens of modern thinking. Now, when you say the phrase the Far East, what nation comes to mind? Everybody thinks about China. But again, as I said, nations that are recorded in the Bible are recorded as it relates to Bible prophecy, are recorded in their relation to Israel. Now, the tribulation period, all of it, is the 70th week of Daniel. Daniel was told that there are 77-year periods carved out or determined for your people in the holy city. So when we get into the fulfillment of the 70th week of Daniel, which is recorded in the book of Revelation, then we have to look at everything through the lens of the nation of Israel. So the kings of the East is not China. It's not a reference to China, and I'll tell you why. The Euphrates River has absolutely no association with China, and the kings of the East would be in reference to kings east of the river Euphrates. Now, if you run down who those nations are, first of all, the headwaters of the Euphrates River are in the mountains of Turkey, Mount Ararat specifically, and most of Turkey lie east of the Euphrates River. Most of Iraq lie east of the Euphrates River. All of Iran lie east of the Euphrates River. Pakistan, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, all of these lie east of the Euphrates River. Now, these are nations that all share one common feature, and that is Islam. And Islam, obviously, much of the radicals are bent on the destruction of the nation of Israel. Now, here's another reason, just a basic reason why we cannot look at the kings of the East as being pointing to, in our modern thinking, the nation of China. The Euphrates River is 3,758 miles from the border of China. And it hardly makes any sense that the Euphrates River would need to dry up for the nation, the kings of the East to cross over. But it makes perfect sense if those nations in which the Euphrates River runs through, or which is a border for the nations that are on the east side, it makes perfect sense. And that also fits more in line with the 70th week of Daniel being recorded in the book of Revelation. So the sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates. Now, this is deep into the tribulation. It's after the seal judgments. It's after the bowl judgments. And the kings of the east are those east of the Euphrates River, not the far east, China. Now, there's another reason I think that people often get mixed up, and I've just heard this recently, and so I just want to straighten this out too while we're at it. And that is Revelation 9:13-16 talks about the sixth angel sounding. Now, these are the trumpet judgments. And I heard the seal judgments, the six seal judgments have happened. The seventh seal is the opening of the seven trumpet judgments. The opening of the seventh trumpet is the bowl judgments and all that follows there. And then the bowl judgments are all seven bowls are God's wrath, and that is seven being the number of completeness. It completes God's wrath on a Christ-rejecting world and finishes the discipline of the nation of Israel. Now, in Revelation 9:13-16, we're told about this sixth angel sounding. I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar, which is before God, saying to the sixth angel who had the trumpet, release the four angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates. So the four angels who had been prepared for the hour and day and month and year were released to kill a third of mankind. Now the number of the army of the horsemen was 200 million. I heard the number of them. And I can't tell you how many times of late I've seen this quoted by pastors in relation to the nation of China. First of all, China does not have a 200 million man army. China's army is about 2.5, somewhere maybe even close to 3 million. China does not have a 200 million man army. Secondly, these horsemen are demons. They are not humans. They are headed up by the head of the demon realm, and they are not human in nature. And just because the Euphrates River is mentioned in both passages, Revelation 9 and Revelation 16, does not create a relationship between these two judgments. This happens in the mid time of the tribulation period. And remember, these are chronological. These judgments do happen in succession. And we know that because, as I mentioned a moment ago, the seventh of the seals and the seventh of the trumpets basically unveils what's coming next. So that tells us there's a chronology. They're not happening simultaneously. So Revelation 9 and Revelation 16 have no relationship to each other as far as timing or events. Revelation 16 is completely separate from Revelation chapter 9. So there is zero relationship between the number 200 million and the kings of the east of Revelation 16. 200 million in Revelation 9 and the kings of the east in Revelation 16. Yes, the Euphrates River is mentioned in both of those, but that just makes sense too, because the whole tribulation period is about the Jews and Jerusalem, and the world is judged for its rejection, wholesale rejection of Christ. So again, just be careful in listening to these things. And to the person who commented last week, no, it was not a slip of the tongue that when I said China is not mentioned in the last days prophetic scenario. And I said that because it isn't. And, we do know that this particular time period has specific targets according to Scripture. And again, as I said, it is the 70th week of Daniel. Daniel was told that there are 77-year periods that are determined, that word means carved out or set aside for your people in the holy city. So we have to look at Revelation 6 through 19 through that lens. It's the nations of the world and their relationship with the nation of Israel. And again, interpret things through that. And also, we have to practice a good exegesis or interpretation of Scripture. And we cannot allow these two mentions of the Euphrates River to mix the message together and make them into one particular prophecy. They happen at two different times during the tribulation period, and they are separated most likely by a period of months or maybe even a year or more. They are unrelated to one another as it relates to the content of both these prophecies. One is at the second to last judgment at the end of the tribulation. This is in the heart of the judgments as they're being poured out on the earth. So China does not have a 200 million man army. This is an army of the demonic realm that is released to kill a third of mankind somewhere at the midpoint of the tribulation period or near the midpoint of the tribulation period. Again, there is no relationship between the 200 million man army in Revelation 9 and the kings of the east in Revelation chapter 16. So just let me clear that up. And, well-meaning pastors have used this and said this, and I would just say it doesn't hold water. It's not true, and the two are totally unrelated to each other. So just be careful. The tendency with a lot of those who teach Bible prophecy today is to sensationalize. And yes, China has a huge population, but the military, as I said, is nowhere near 200 million. This is going to be a force of demons that go out and kill a third of mankind, as the Scripture says. So with that, let's move on. And let me first introduce something that I think is very exciting in relation to Bible prophecy, and that is that coming on May 14th, according to our calendar in the West, May 15th in Israel, Israel is going to celebrate its diamond anniversary. 75 years old. Now, that should be exciting to us because we know there is coming a generation that will not pass away until everything in the Olivet Discourse is recorded. Now, again, there are those who dispute whether or not the fig tree represents Israel. Clearly, I believe it absolutely represents the nation of Israel. And, I've talked about this before, but let me just run through it again. People look at Matthew 24 and 25, and they look at Luke 21 and say, the fig tree is just an illustration. But if you read Mark's gospel, Mark's the only gospel record of the Passion Week that gives a strict chronology of events in relation to the fig tree. On the day after the triumphal entry, which would be Monday of the Passion Week, Jesus rode into Jerusalem, accepted worship for the first time publicly as the one who comes in the name of the Lord, as Jews lined the street, threw out palm branches and declared, Baruch Hashem Adonai, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And then Mark's gospel says the next day they were headed towards Jerusalem and they encountered a fig tree. And it was not the season for figs, but Jesus went to the tree to find something to eat. He found nothing and he cursed the tree. And this was on Monday. Then Tuesday, even though the text says the tree dried up immediately, the disciples obviously didn't notice that. But the next day, they came upon the tree, according to Mark's gospel. Again, they came upon the fig tree the next day. That's Tuesday of the Passion Week. And it was observed that the tree had dried up from the roots. Now, Hosea and Joel both record, and Jeremiah does as well. Jeremiah actually calls Israel a fruitless fig tree, and it wasn't the season for figs. And if the fig tree represents Israel, we know that this prophetically means it wasn't the time for the Jews to recognize their Messiah. And thus the Lord and the Holy Spirit and Paul, the apostle, would open up the time of the Gentiles, or at least the church age. The time of the Gentiles began back in 586 BC. But the church age would then introduce Pentecost and the fulfillment of that, and the church would spread around the world to the Gentile nations, because it wasn't the season where the Jews were going to accept Israel's Messiah. That's going to happen according to Zechariah 12, verse 10, at the second coming of Christ, when they look upon the one whom they pierced and mourn for him as one mourns for an only son. So it was purposeful that Jesus went to this tree, knowing full well it wasn't the season for figs. And on the next day, the observation was made by the disciples that the tree had dried up from the roots. Now, this speaks of the diaspora, the Jews being scattered around the world after 70 AD and the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. And then on Wednesday, so Monday, they encountered the fruitless fig tree and Jesus cursed it. Tuesday, they observed that the tree was dried up from the roots, speaking of the diaspora. Then on Wednesday is when Jesus taught the Sermon on the Mount, because Mark's gospel says, and the next day. So we got Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. And on Wednesday, Jesus says, learn this lesson from the fig tree. Now, this wasn't a generalization. He's talking to 4 of the same 12 people who saw and heard what he did on the previous 2 days. So if on Monday it represented fruitless Israel, and Tuesday it represented fruitless Israel, on Wednesday, talking to the same people with the same teacher, and he says, learn this lesson not from a fig tree, but from the fig tree. The fig tree absolutely represents the nation of Israel. And Jesus said in the Olivet Discourse, when you see the fig tree budding and putting forth leaves, in other words, when Israel becomes a nation again and begins to grow in population again, know that summer is near, even at the door. And he's using, the illustration of the process of the fig tree putting forth leaves and then later figs to illustrate a point. And this generation that sees the fig tree budding will not pass away. Now, we don't know how long a generation is. We don't know exactly what Jesus meant by that. The Bible hints at in the Psalms that, a man's days will be 70 years, or if by reason of strength, 80. We don't know if that tells us how long a generation is. And it could simply mean that whoever was alive on May 14th, 1948, not all of them are going to die before the whole Olivet Discourse scenario plays out. Whichever, Israel's getting older. Israel is just about to celebrate their 75th anniversary. So this is why Jesus would say in the Olivet Discourse, therefore you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming in an hour you do not expect him. And we are living in a season of unprecedented unexpectedness of the return of Christ. And, the vast majority of the church, I read some stats some time ago that only 6.6% of Christians are expecting the rapture of the church, of the 2.42 billion that call themselves Christians around the world. So the Jews certainly aren't expecting the return of the Messiah. And Muslims and other nations aren't expecting the return of the Messiah, in the sense, at least, that the Muslims believe in the second coming, but they believe that Jesus is going to come again and tell the whole world that Christianity and Judaism are lies and Islam is the truth. They believe that Jesus is going to return, get married, die, be buried beside Muhammad, and none of that stuff's going to happen. But we are near an aging marker, if you will, of an aging Israel, with this diamond jubilee or diamond anniversary coming up on May 14th, 1948. So listen, with everything else that's going on, with watching the lawlessness abound in our world today and all the things happening, our redemption is nigh. And so just be careful out there. And I wanted to start with this because it's important, and not to get too hyped up over somebody sensationalizing something, even if it's insincerity. And even if, somehow they heard this and repeated it. Listen, Revelation 9 and Revelation 16 are completely separate events and have no relationship with each other. You cannot say that the kings of the East number 200 million in their army. Those are unrelated things completely. So let's move on. And I wanted to start with reminding you of the diamond anniversary of the birth of the nation of Israel, or the rebudding of the fig tree. So now we can talk about some of the things happening in our world today. We know that Zechariah talks in 12 verse 3 about the whole of the world being against Jerusalem being a burdensome stone for all peoples. Now, remember, much like someone would use the phrase Washington in reference to the government of the U.S., but it was representative of the whole country, or someone would say London, and London said, and that would represent the government of Great Britain, and representative of all of its people. The same is true of Jerusalem in this context. Jerusalem, or in other words, the capital of Israel, the whole of the nation, is going to become a burdensome stone to all peoples. And our first story comes from All Israel News and is in line with what we just said. The UN will recognize Nakba Day of Catastrophe, as Israel's Independence Day for the first time. For the first time, the UN General Assembly will observe Palestinian Nakba Day on May 15th to lament 75 years of Israeli independence. Nearly every Middle Eastern country, including members of the Abraham Accords, voted in favor of the resolution to recognize the birth of Israel in 1948 as a day of catastrophe for the Muslim world, particularly Palestinians. The UN passed the resolution in December to observe Nakba Day, calling for a high-level event at the General Assembly Hall. And following the vote, Palestinian envoy to the UN, Riyad Mansour, described it as seeing this General Assembly finally acknowledge the historical injustice that befell the Palestinian people, adopting a resolution that decides to commemorate in this General Assembly Hall the 75th anniversary of the Nakba. And listen, this is such a bunch of nonsense, and the United Nothing is an appropriate title for the UN, and or unnecessary, as Amir likes to call them. And, first of all, when Palestinians were referred to back at the turn of the 19th to 20th century, when the media would use the term Palestinians, they were referring to the Jews that lived there, because in 136 AD, the Roman Emperor Hadrian, because of his hatred for the Jews, renamed the area Palestina, the Latinized form of Philistine. Now, listen, the Philistines are not Arabs. They never were. In antiquity, they're referred to as the Aegean Sea people. They're from the Isle of Crete. They are not Arab peoples. And these modern-day Palestinians are absolutely, undeniably Arab peoples. And so, therefore, they cannot be the descendants of the Philistines, and therefore they have absolutely no right to the land of Israel. And, even though the Canaanites possessed the land before Israel came in to take over, so to speak, it doesn't matter who was there first. If God gave you the land, it's your land. And Jerusalem and Israel have a history within that land for some 3,600 years. And the Palestinians that lay claim to being pushed out of their land had no claim to that land whatsoever. Many of them were Bedouin people, and simply, wandered and followed their flocks and things of that nature. And Palestinians have accused Jewish fighters, the article goes on to say, many of whom survived the Holocaust only to pick up arms in defense of the nascent state of Israel, of committing atrocities and of forcibly expelling Arabs across the country following Israel's victory in the 1948 War of Independence. Now, remember, on the eve of David Ben-Gurion's declaration that Israel is a state once again, Israel was attacked by 5 nations. The charge was led by Egypt. And yet, interestingly, in the first several battles, major battles, Egypt was the primary force behind it. And with a sizable military, they were defeated every time. And, the Bible says that Egypt and Assyria, which would be in relation to Mesopotamia or the Babylonian area, would be one with Israel during the millennial reign of Christ, and they'll share the same language. And Egypt is not named in the Ezekiel invasion. And now here we see in modern times, Israel and Egypt are in cooperation together, fighting against ISIS in the Negev and other things we know in relation to them. I mean, they're very definitely still Arab-minded. But the truth of the matter is, this land that God gave them is their land, and they were in the land and had a constant presence in the land. even though the bulk of them were scattered amongst the nations by the judicial hand and nature of God, only to be brought back into the land, which Amos the prophet says that they will never be uprooted again when they come back into the land. But here we have, in the days leading up to Israel's War of Independence and during the first few weeks of the war, around 700,000 Arab residents of Britain's mandatory Palestine fled from the area set apart for the Jewish state in the UN's 1947 partition plan, and from the areas chosen to be part of a future Arab state. Do you know why they fled those areas? They fled those areas because Egypt and Syria and the other nations invading Israel said, get away from the Jews, we're going to wipe them off the surface of the earth. And that's why they fled. They didn't flee because of the Jews. They fled because of hopes of destroying the Jews. And that's why you still have these refugee camps, even all these years later, nearly 3/4 of a century later, you still have refugees. Well, think about it. If your neighbor moved away so you could be slaughtered, would you welcome them moving back next door? I don't think so. It doesn't even make sense. But again, the misinformation age that we live in, and the creation of the Mandate of Palestine followed a previous partition of British territories taken from the Ottoman Empire. In that partition, the article says the territory of Palestine, which the British originally intended for Jewish settlement alone, was separated from the territory called Transjordan. And Transjordan in 1946 would become the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. However, the Arab nations rejected the idea of a Jewish state and did not agree to the UN partition plan. Nakba Day has been observed by some Arabs since 1949, when those who were displaced living under Jordanian rule in Judea and Samaria, also known as the West Bank, protested the failure of the Arab League armies to drive out the Jews. There's the answer as why they moved out. They wanted the Jews driven out. So again, this incredible prophetic event that took place on May 14th, 1948, is still causing angst today. And now the United Nations is standing against Israel and leading the charge to the fulfillment of Zechariah 12:3, where the whole of the world is going to be against Israel. Now, the Hill reports that the battle lines are being drawn for a war across East Asia involving Taiwan. Now, we know there's going to be wars and rumors of wars in the last days, and they will have an exponential increase and continue to advance in frequency and intensity like labor pains upon a pregnant woman. And the article says the United States has strengthened its defenses in East Asia by gaining year-round permanent access to 9 bases in the Philippines. These aren't American bases, but U.S. troops can move freely in and out for exercises or, for that matter, for a real war. And this month, the bases are supporting more than 17,000 U.S. and Philippine troops in the biggest war games in the Philippines in years. The Philippine President Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. has reversed the policies of his predecessor, Rodrigo Duterte, who undermined the U.S.-Philippine alliance by courting China. Duterte saw a warm relationship with China's President Xi Jinping as necessary to head off armed conflict in the South China Sea, which Beijing claims belongs to China. And Bongbong, whose father, Ferdinand Marcos, ruled as a dictator for 18 years before his overthrow in the People Power revolution in 1986, has decided the future ties and renewing close ties with Washington. The Americans have had to evacuate their huge air and naval bases more than 30 years ago after the Philippine Senate refused to renew the lease. They will not be returning in the same huge numbers, but Bongbong has decided they're needed while China harasses Philippine boats, chasing them out of customary fishing grounds and threatening to take over small Philippine inlets. Now, the Associated Foreign Press gives us a companion article that says, "Get ready. Taiwan civilians trained for Chinese invasions." And this is the reason for the U.S. presence increase in the Philippines. Physician Lin Yu-Ting has taken time out of her weekend, the article says, to learn civilian defense tips she can relay to her 2 young children in case China invades self-ruled Taiwan. There are no weapons, just vital training on how to react to China's hybrid warfare. The classes are part of a growing Taiwanese urgency to be ready for a worst case scenario after seeing the Ukraine war from afar ended during 2 rounds of Chinese drills in the past year, including exercises that ended last week. When there's a possibility of a war, I think we should get prepared, said 45-year-old Lin, who attended the Kuma Academy's classes in Taipei. Being on the front line isn't the only way to help, she added, adding her 8 and 12-year-old children should know what to do in a crisis. And Kuma's instructors offer practical tips on evacuation preparations, such as finding the nearest air raid shelter and what to pack in emergency go bags. But they also focus on disinformation around what Beijing's invasion would look like, countering claims of 1,000 missiles raining down on the island or 50,000 ships landing on its shores. The organizers say they are building a first line of psychic defense against Chinese narratives, trying to sow distrust in Taiwan's democratic system and its defensive capabilities. In these day-long classes, which cost 1,000 Taiwanese dollars, $33 US, and with emergency medical training such as how to apply tourniquets and stuff wounds with bandages. And instructors used images from Saving Private Ryan's Omaha beach landing scene and missile strikes on residential areas in Ukraine to convey their points to the lessons. Can you imagine living like that, just taking preparation for an invasion from a nation that has over 1 billion population, in China, or Taiwan's rather population is some 23 million people. And but yet here you've got the Chinese government. They see themselves as kind of the same way Putin does, as necessary to dominate the world, move away from U.S. domination, and all these other things. We'll talk a little bit more about the advancement of that particular effort in a moment. Now, Newsmax says Russian sub simulates attack on carrier strike group in the Pacific. A Russian nuclear-powered submarine performed a drill in the Pacific Ocean on Wednesday that simulated the destruction of a mock aircraft carrier strike group. Russian state news outlet Interfax reported that the Tomsk submarine performed the exercise using 22 Granite anti-ship cruise missiles at targets about 125 miles away. The simulation was part of exercises by Russia's Pacific Fleet that started Friday to assess its combat readiness. The nuclear submarine Tomsk, as a part of a sudden check of the combat readiness of the Pacific Fleet, was put on full combat readiness, Roman Velichenko, the vessel's commander, said, according to Interfax. It deployed to the area of execution of combat training tasks for its intended purpose, the destruction of enemy aircraft carrier strike groups, landing units, and convoys. Ships and submarines of Russia's Pacific Fleet moved from their bases to the Sea of Japan, the Sea of Okhotsk, and the Bering Sea, the Russian Defense Ministry said Friday, according to Interfax. And Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said more than 25,000 servicemen, 167 ships, including 12 subs, and 89 aircraft and helicopters were participating in the exercises since Friday. And a lot of this is next level saber rattling, just a show of strength, much like the U.S. put a carrier in the Mediterranean just to kind of wave a warning flag at Iran after the recent overtures made by them and others about the destruction of Israel and the planned efforts to destroy them. And this is part of what this is. And again, we live in a time where, the Bible has foretold us that it's going to be like this. And now we're watching it just increase dramatically and exponentially in a rather brief period of time. I remember we had 4 years under the previous administration where we didn't have wars and things of that nature going on. The world was relatively peaceful. And then just all of a sudden, it's just like all hell broke loose, to use that phrase. And this is what we're seeing today. There's just rampant lawlessness, nation rising against nation, kingdom against kingdom, just like Jesus said it's going to be when it's time for him to come back. And again, let me point your minds to aging Israel and that fig tree mentioned in the Olivet Discourse. And again, I cannot underscore the importance of that too much. It's just clearly tells us in the midst of, all the arguments made, well, no man knows the day or the hour. when Jesus said that, he followed that with, but as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be when the Son of Man returns. And buying and selling, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark. And they did not know what was coming upon them. So that tells them, or tells us rather, that it was a time of low expectation. And here we're seeing this, and so many other things happen. The perilous times Paul talked about in 2 Timothy chapter 3. And by the way, we're going to start a study, if you're interested, through 1st and 2nd Timothy this Sunday morning. We'll look at 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 1 through 11 as we begin that journey. And there's a lot of hefty information in 1st and 2nd Timothy, a lot of prophetic information, particularly in the latter portion of 1 Timothy, and then also in the 2 Timothy, especially chapter 4. We've got a lot of information that's related to today. So if you'd like to join us, you can go to cctustin.org or watch. It takes a day or so for it to get uploaded to YouTube. We like to clean it up and, just present the message, because anytime you have the worship, and by the way, just because this question comes up a lot, let me just throw this out there. Most churches pay a copyright fee. We do. We pay it every year for the right to sing songs that other people have written, and they, get their little royalty from it. And, but if you, have the worship, especially on Facebook, you'll get a copyright infringement immediately, and they'll shut your thing down. So on YouTube, which is our primary viewing source for Sunday messages, and the lineup, we don't put the worship music up, and just a message so you can hear the Bible being taught. So anyway, if you want, you can join here on YouTube, probably Tuesday of next week, and we'll start our study through 1st and 2nd Timothy. Now, again, along the same lines, the Jerusalem Post is reporting that Russian spy ships were spotted operating in the North Sea near the UK. Now, I don't know if any of you caught this, but Putin recently made a speech about the West and what a danger the West has become to the rest of the world because of the lunacy that's happening in our country, and specifically the U.S. and Great Britain seem to be leading the charge into insanity. And, as much as I disagree with the invasion of Ukraine or China's efforts to overtake Taiwan, the things that Putin said, and it kind of goes back to that old adage, even a broken clock's right twice a day. He had some very strong words about the idiotic things that are happening in Western culture, and that people need to be protected from this lunacy. And, he pointed to the Bible multiple times and said that God, created male and female, not this gender dysphoria. And many of the things that he said were making complete sense. And this is what he's using to back up their aggressive nature. We've got to protect ourselves from the idiotic West. And, just watching some of the things happen, like the old saying goes, he ain't wrong. The West has just lost its mind. It's just unbelievable, the things that we are defending today and promoting today. Things that used to get you thrown in jail are now protected rights. Just unbelievable. But the Russian spy ship spotted operating in the North Sea near the UK, according to this report. And the article says a clandestine Russian spy fleet is reportedly operating in Scandinavian waters, mapping different offshore wind farms, gas pipelines and power and communication infrastructure throughout the North Sea as far as Scotland, according to a joint investigation by Scandinavian broadcasters. Sources cited by the broadcasters claim the fleet of ghost ships includes both military and civilian ships, and that the mission has the goal planning acts of sabotage against the Nordic nations. All these findings were detailed in the documentary series The Shadow War, made by Danish broadcaster, Norwegian broadcaster NRK, Danish broadcaster DR, Norwegian broadcaster NRK, Swedish broadcaster SVT, and the Finnish broadcaster YLE. According to the report, the broadcasters managed to catch Russian naval communications. Using this, they were able to learn a lot about the spy fleet. One of the ships in the fleet is the Russian naval vessel, the Admiral Vladimirsky, which officially does marine research. However, according to the DR, It's also used for intelligence operations. This report has been corroborated by other outlets. According to The Guardian, a former Royal Navy expert tracked the Admiral Vladimirsky's route, which took it close to wind farms near the UK and the Netherlands. And back in November, the UK Defence Journal had reported that the same ship was spotted near Scotland near a base for maritime patrol aircraft. Russian naval activities in the North Sea, the Russia-Ukraine war, and tensions with NATO caused this report on Russian spy ships to come about and underscores several ongoing tensions between Russia and the West, particularly the Nordic countries. And following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the two traditionally neutral Nordic states of Finland and Sweden both vocalized their intention of joining NATO, something Russia expressed displeasure at. And this is the reason for these visits. Now, interesting that the article talks about the fact that they are in close proximity to wind farms and gas pipelines, power and communication infrastructure in the North Sea as far as Scotland. And that, I believe, plays a significant role in some of the things that are coming. And our next story, I think, gives us an insight as to why this particular area is being targeted or investigated, or intelligence being sought out. Breitbart reports that power and water, Russian hackers trying to take out our critical infrastructure, the UK warns. Britain's National Cyber Security Center issued an official threat notice to operators of Britain's electricity, water, and other critical systems, telling them to boost their defenses. I don't think we're doing enough to protect our infrastructure from the cyber threats emerging from Russia-aligning groups, the center's chief, Lindy Cameron, said. Cabinet Minister Oliver Dowden said the threat comes from hackers sympathetic to Russia, though not necessarily directed by the Russian state. He described them as cyber equivalent of the Wagner Group, the private Russian company with mercenaries fighting in Ukraine. He said that while the alleged hackers currently lack the capacity to do widespread damage to the UK systems, the threat is growing. Disclosing this threat is not something we do lightly, but it's necessary for companies to understand the current risks they face and take action to defend themselves and the country, Dowden said at a cybersecurity conference in Belfast. These are the companies in charge of keeping our country running, of keeping the lights on, he said, and our shared prosperity depends on them taking their own security seriously. And the National Cybersecurity Center, a branch of UK Cyber Intelligence Agency, said cyber attackers could begin to broaden their focus from Ukraine to the wider West as the war drags on. And Cameron also sounded a warning about the dramatic rise of China as a technology superpower. Now, this is interesting because I've always found it kind of curious that, much of what we see in the book of Revelation, we're reading about horsemen and these battles. Even in Ezekiel, you see kind of archaic weaponry named there, shields and bucklers and things common to warfare a couple of centuries ago, and not certainly the modern technological weapons that we see today. And, some of that could very well be, that the hackers do take down systems. And why, as we talked about earlier in the program, why does the Euphrates River need to dry up to make way for the kings of the East? Why would Turkey and Iran and these other nations, these predominantly Muslim nations, why would they need a river to dry up in order to attack Israel? And why? And, the next thing that we see recorded there is a battle based in the Megiddo Valley, the Battle of Armageddon, as we like to refer to it. And, could it be that, all of this electronic and technological equipment that we have today is disabled? Maybe, as we've talked about in the past, it's a coronal mass ejection, shot out from the sun, and the magnetosphere breaks down and disables all electronic equipment on the earth. Maybe cyber warfare contributes to some of this, and the need to go back to, I think it was Dennis Quaid. I'm not sure why he made a comment on it, but he said, recently a cyber attack would take us back or send us back to the 1880s. and we would be basically back to traveling on foot or by animal or whatever. But who knows what role this is all going to play. But we do know that technology does definitely play a role in the tribulation period. We'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. But I don't know. I just think it's awful curious that this is part of modern warfare. Because, here in the States, we've had power grids attacked. And, I mean, why would somebody go in and drive by a power substation and just shoot it up with handguns? They're just test driving to see what kind of damage they can cause and what would be necessary to take out a power substation to leave millions of people without power. And you just think about all the things that rely on computer technology today. And if you can disable that, you can disable weapon systems. You can render even ground equipment because tanks are run by computers, and all of our cars have a computer chip in them these days. You can basically just shut a country down and put people back on foot, and in a sense disarm them, except for small arms that don't rely rather on some type of computer technology in order to operate. So, but who knows? But it's interesting that this is constantly in the news today, and people are preparing for it. And it seems as though those who are going to seek to use that as part of the advancement of their cause are putting forth great effort into this cyber warfare. And Newsmax reports that Moscow preps secret weapon to take down Starlink. And Moscow's efforts to take down the Starlink satellite operations that billionaire Elon Musk has been providing to Ukraine's military since the beginning days of the war appear to be more advanced than thought, according to a classified U.S. intelligence report leaked through the messaging platform Discord. The assessment, which dates to March, says Russia has been testing its TOBOL electronic warfare systems to disrupt Starlink's capabilities, but doesn't indicate if any of the tests have been successful, reports the Washington Post, which obtained the report. SpaceX, which owns Starlink, did not comment, but last May, Musk wrote on Twitter that Starlink had shown its resilience against jamming and hacking attempts, but said Russia appeared at that time to be intensifying its efforts against the technology. The Pentagon did not address the questions about the leaked assessment, but the Defense Department spokesman, Major General Charlie Dietz, said the military is focused on getting the Ukrainians the satellite capabilities they need. And again, this is our technology dependence that we have in these last days, even for mechanized warfare. And the Russian embassy in Washington did not return a request for comment. Oh, no kidding. And a spokesman for the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, however, said officials in Kiev are taking measures to neutralize Russia's efforts. And the Ukraine military uses Starlink's portable terminals for battlefield and intelligence communications. And Russia has been able to disrupt Ukraine's use of radios and cell phones, but Starlink's satellite signals are more difficult to interrupt. Now, again, watching all this happen and the role of technology, we just don't know what all is going to happen during the tribulation. The Bible gives us a lot of information and tells us, many, many specifics about what's going to happen then. And by the way, let me just remind you that the Great Escape precedes the Great Tribulation. We don't have an appointment with any of the tribulation. We will not be here for the first half. There is no midpoint rapture. There is no pre-wrath rapture. There is no post-trib rapture. The rapture happens at the beginning of the tribulation. And I say that with confidence because it's the 70th week of Daniel. What's going to happen on the earth has nothing to do with the church. Matter of fact, the church is absent from Revelation 6 to 19, where all the specifics are given regarding the fulfillment of the 70th week of Daniel. We won't be here for any of it, but boy, we are sure watching the precursors to what's going to develop during the tribulation happening all around us. And, our next story, I hesitated to report this because I don't know what's going to happen with the United States. And again, just like China, the U.S. is not mentioned in Bible prophecy, which, I find to be rather curious simply because the U.S., even though it accounts for well under 5% of the total global population, we are the most powerful nation in the world. We are the most generous nation in the world. There's never been any nation like the United States of America. And now, all of a sudden, things are imploding, and we're headed in the opposite direction quicker than anyone could have even have dreamed of. And what I mean by the opposite direction is we have gone from being blessed by God as a nation whose God is the Lord, even though, America is not an equivalent to Israel. There's only one ethnic people group who are the chosen people of God. That is the Jews. But when a nation calls God the Lord, and they're there in Psalm 33, I think it's verse 12 where that's mentioned, the word nation is goyim. It's not talking about Israel. It's talking about non-Jewish nations. And any nation who says God is the Lord is going to be blessed. And we have been blessed because our very Declaration of Independence has stated, that all men have been endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are these: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And yes, America has huge failures in its past. Yes, America had great mistakes and a blight on its past with slavery and all the other things. But the fact is, we've still been a blessed nation, and a nation beyond wealth of any other nation in the history of the world. And yet here we are, imploding and downgrading at breakneck speed. And Bloomberg reports the de-dollarization is happening at a stunning pace. The dollar is losing its reserve status at a faster pace than generally accepted, as many analysts have failed to account for last year's wild exchange rate moves, according to Stephen Jen. The greenback's share in global reserves slid last year at 10 times the average speed of the past 2 decades, as a number of countries look for alternatives after Russia's invasion of Ukraine triggered sanctions. Jen and his Eurizon SLJ Capital Limited colleague Joanna Frary wrote in a note, adjusting for exchange rate movements, the dollar has lost about 11% of its market share since 2016 and double that amount since 2008, they said. The dollar suffered a stunning collapse in 2022 in its market share as a reserve currency, presumably due to its muscular use of sanctions, Jen and Frary wrote. Exceptional actions taken by the U.S. and its allies against Russia have startled large reserve holding countries, most of which are emerging economies from the so-called global south, they said. And Jen is the former Morgan Stanley currency guru who coined the dollar simile theory. Last year, Bloomberg's gauge of the greenback surged as much as 16% as the conflict helped fuel a rise in global inflation that triggered a widespread interest rate hikes, which sank bond and currency markets alike and finished up the year at 6%. And, again, when you've got China and Russia cooperating together and their massive populations, especially China's, moving away from the dollar and the petrodollar, especially, where everything has to be translated into dollars to in the petroleum products market. They're moving away from that and wanting to do this, which brings in billions of dollars to the U.S. economy, or to the U.S. government, I should say. This is just another damaging international effort to bring down the U.S. And, here we've got nations who have that as their mantra. The Iranians, small nation as they are by comparison, want to see the great Satan eliminated. And the great Satan is the U.S. and the little Satan is Israel. And, there are other nations who share that ideology. And, of course, China and Russia want to move away from our influence in the international energy products market and take us down. And that requires taking down the dollar. And the dollar's role as an international currency won't be challenged anytime soon, as developing countries don't yet have the ability to divest from the greenback for transactions due to its large, liquid, and well-functioning financial markets, Jen and Frary wrote. Still, the persistence of those conditions is not preordained, and there may come a time when the rest of the world actively avoids using the dollar, they wrote. Now, again, as I've said, and many other Bible prophecy teachers say, the U.S. is not in the last days prophecy scenario. Could it be from implosion and the U.S. no longer becomes a factor? And, one of the things I think we need to keep in mind is that God is still on the throne. And, when nations are leading the way around the world and creating ways, inventors of evil things, as Romans talked about, when you do those sorts of things, God gives you over to those things and you become adversarial instead of a nation that is being blessed by God. And, with all the things that the U.S. is doing today, it's very possible that the U.S. will simply implode. And, I hope that the rapture is what causes the U.S. not to be mentioned in the last days prophetic scenario. But it's clearly the U.S., as Billy Graham once said, if God doesn't judge the United States, he owes an apology to Sodom and Gomorrah. And the heinous things done in our nation, the treatment of women in these last days via this whole trans movement and the other thing, and basically eliminating women in sports and women's sports becoming now dominated by men and all these other things, to say nothing of the millions and millions and millions of preborn children that have been slaughtered inside their mother's womb where they ought to be safe and growing. And, could very well be as the world moves away. And we have to remember that God has used nations to judge other nations and then punish those nations that he used in the form of judgment later. But, God has used this type of thing in the past to deal with nations that are predominantly evil. And I have to say, I believe that the reason that the U.S. has not experienced judgment so far is the presence of the church. And, as Abraham negotiated with God over Sodom and Gomorrah because of his nephew Lot living there, he said, it's not like you, Lord, to punish the righteous with the unrighteous. And there's still a strong presence of the church here. And that's another reason I believe it's necessary that the church be removed before God pours out his wrath, because 1 Thessalonians 5:9 says we don't have an appointment with wrath. Now, the Daily Caller says Elon Musk tells Tucker Carlson AI could absolutely take control of civilization. Elon Musk told Fox News host Tucker Carlson Monday that it was absolutely possible for artificial intelligence to take control of civilization and make decisions for people. That's real. It is conceivable that AI could take control and reach a point where you couldn't turn it off and it would be making decisions for people. Carlson, co-founder of the Daily Caller, asked Musk during an interview that aired Monday. Yep, absolutely, Musk responded. And Musk is starting a new firm to challenge ChatGPT based on a system originally developed by OpenAI, a firm he co-founded with Google co-founder Larry Page, according to the Financial Times. OpenAI is backed by Microsoft, while Google released Bard, a competing artificial intelligence product, in February. And Musk departed from the company in 2018 over concerns about the safety of artificial intelligence. He has been an outspoken advocate for regulating the technology. Fox News reports that an AI leader says tech will reveal problems or could go off the rails, and humans must still, quote, ride herd, end quote, over it. AI will help meet the high demand for reliability across various industries, but won't provide solutions to problems, the article says. This is a skill artificial intelligence will never have, according to Jessica Milligan. Tech expert Jessica Milligan discusses Twitter CEO Elon Musk's concerns about AI and his claims the U.S. government had access to Twitter on the evening edit and Twitter direct messages on the evening edit. And the rapid rise of artificial intelligence has stoked angst among the people who fear that such complex machines will render their jobs obsolete. And while AI will undoubtedly create some upheavals in the years to come, a business leader who led development of his company's AI solution and spoke with Fox News Business thinks we are overestimating the damage AI will do. And former Texas Railroad Commissioner Ryan Sitton, and the founder and CEO of Pinnacle Reliability, a company that uses data, including AI, to help complex process facilities like oil refineries, mining operations, and lumber mills to make more strategic decisions. And since the company's founding in 26, Sitton has watched and led dramatic advances in technology as well as shifts in the global supply chain. Now, there's less margin for error, he says, in general, in the way the world operates concerning the state of complex industries today. And today we've got real time information about how things are moving. And as a result, demand for things to operate predictably or reliably is even higher. And Sitton believes that AI, including Newton, will play a major role in analyzing these incredibly complex systems, but humans will not be entirely left out of the equation. AI, he argued, could, quote, easily go off the rails. And, the reason I think we need to keep an eye on this is because, there's some type of image in Revelation 13 of the beast whose deadly wound was healed that has the appearance of being brought back to life. And is this artificial intelligence? Quite possible, as we see just a normalizing of watching images on screens, and some of the artificially generated portraits today. You can't really tell, whether is that a real person or is that, actually an AI. And as we see, even with I think in the movie industry, what do they call it? CGI, computer generated imagery. I mean, we're used to watching things that aren't real all the time. And now, here we've got on the cusp of, I believe, the tribulation period beginning within the not too distant future after the rapture of the church. We've got a world that is ready to believe that an image, maybe an AI generated image, is actually real. So that's why it's important to keep an eye on these things. And, the Bible said, Jesus in particular, talking about lawlessness abounding in the last days, the love of many growing cold. And the Gateway Pundit reports a sad story. And this kind of goes on the heels of what's happening in Portland. There's been 2 Walmart stores in Portland that have been absolutely decimated, looted, and destroyed just in the past 2 weeks. And a Home Depot worker, the Gateway Pundit reports, in his 20s is shot dead trying to stop a shoplifter in lawless Democrat-controlled state. A male Home Depot worker in his 20s has been shot dead while attempting to stop a shoplifter in the lawless state of California. 100% Fed Up reports the employee, who has not yet been identified, has been referred to by his coworkers as Blake and is reportedly a male in his 20s. The store is located in Pleasanton, California, east of the crime-ridden city of San Francisco, home of Representative Nancy Pelosi. In 2018, now get this, 2018, here we are in 2023, Pleasanton was listed as one of the top 10 places to visit in the whole of the United States. And now it's a crime-ridden city. The murdered Home Depot employee was working in the loss prevention center when he attempted to stop an in-store theft. And the Pleasanton Police Department released a statement regarding the murder that took place inside the Home Depot and said, our dispatch center received calls about a man who was bleeding inside the store, and officers rendered aid to the victim. He was immediately transported to the nearby hospital. And witnesses reported the victim attempted to stop a theft in progress, wherein a struggle ensued. The man was shot, and the suspects were seen immediately driving away from the scene after the shooting. Allied agencies were notified of the description of the wanted vehicle, and approximately at 2:30 p.m., deputies with the Alameda County Sheriff's Office located the vehicle and successfully detained the suspects near the 7,000 block of Ney Avenue in Oakland. And the man, after being rushed to the hospital, died a couple of hours later. And again, here you've got these rules, these new laws in California in particular. Not sure how many other states have adopted such ridiculous laws, but you can't do anything if somebody is stealing something that's worth less than $900. And that's, when this law first passed, there were lines of cars outside of Nordstrom stores all over the state, where there's some stories reported 25 cars in line filled with people who would just run into the store and steal less than $900 worth of stuff, go jump into cars and drive off. And 25 times 900, that's a lot of money. And that's why you see stores closing in certain areas and not wanting to do business there anymore. The losses are just too great. And lawlessness is abounding in ways and levels like never before. Now, here's the real issue this lawlessness is promoted and protected by the government, at least here in the United States. And just absolutely ridiculous what's going on in our world. And one last story, and we'll wrap things up. And I always have to throw these in because I track this kind of stuff and find it interesting. An Eiffel Tower-sized asteroid is due to soar past Earth next week. This is NASA reporting a massive 1,312-foot asteroid is forecast to sail past the Earth in a relatively close encounter on April 26th. The asteroid, named 2006 HV5, remember, when you have an asteroid, the year it's spotted is within its name, will pass our planet at speeds of around 38,922 miles an hour, according to a close approach data from NASA's Center for Near-Earth Object Studies. That's some 22 times the speed of a bullet. The asteroid measures around 1,300 feet in diameter. The Eiffel Tower, for comparison, is just under 1,100 feet tall. 2006 HV5 will pass the Earth at 6.3 lunar distances, or 6.3 times the distance between the Earth and the Moon. This equates to about 1.5 million miles, which seems extremely far, but in terms of space, it's a pretty close flyby. Our nearest planetary neighbor, Venus, is 38 million miles away from us at its closest point. Asteroids are bits of planets that didn't happen, it says. The article goes on to say, which isn't necessarily true. But the truth is, something, and with the efforts to, interrupt or destroy asteroids and all that asteroid has to do is bump into something, and next thing you know, it's added to Earth. And, there is an asteroid belt surrounding our galaxy and solar system, I should say. And, you just never know. And I like to keep us thinking about these kind of things because we do know that during the tribulation, a great mountain burning with fire is thrown into the sea, and a third of the fish and a third of the ships are destroyed. And it very clearly, I believe, is a solid body that comes in from outside of the Earth and our atmosphere and is thrown into the sea and causes cataclysmic damage. So, and these things, and the article went on to say that most of the time, these near Earth approaching objects are spotted only days before they're going to arrive. And we've reported on stories where that's happened time and time again. So just throwing that out there, 1.5 million miles means we're safe, but you just never know. Something could happen and change the trajectory, or something could be on the way that we don't even know about. And it could be just days' notice before it happens. So, and all that stuff is going to go down during the tribulation, with which we have no appointment with. We won't be here for any of it. So bless the Lord for that. But that should motivate us to go tell people about Jesus and increase the number who are expecting his glorious appearing and meeting us in the air, with the dead in Christ rising first, and us who are alive and remain meeting them in the air. Well, that's it for this week, and I hope you take to heart the little encouragement we had, and maybe a little doctrinal housekeeping, and make sure that we're not getting caught up into sensationalism. The Bible is very clear on the series and order of events that will take place during the tribulation period, and let's not mix things up and mesh them together to create something that causes viewers or makes people clickbait, as the term says today. And the Bible's quite clear. Yeah, there's going to be something that's related to the Euphrates River in chapter 9 and something related to the Euphrates River in chapter 16, but they are unrelated to one another. The one in chapter 9 has nothing to do with the drying up of the river, but rather the releasing of the four angels who've been bound there, holding back this 200 million man demon force, and or horsemen, the number of the horsemen, I should say. So that's it again for this week. And thank you for joining us. And I pray that you were informed and encouraged, and I hope even challenged a bit to get busy for the kingdom. Jesus is coming soon. The expectancy level is extremely low in these last days, just as Jesus said it would be. Israel's getting older by the day, coming up on 75 years in just about less than a month now. And we need to be looking up because our redemption is nigh. Well, that's it for me. And we'll see you either here, there, or in the air. God bless you.